Rodinal is a highly concentrated black and white developer. To use it as intended, you need to dilute this stuff by a lot. The most common dilutions are 1 to 25, 1 to 50, and 1 to 100. 35mm requires about 300 milliliters of solution. So 1 to 100, you would use 3 milliliters of Rodinal to 297 milliliters of water, which is really diluted, especially when you compare it to other developers which could have dilutions of 1 to 4 or 1 to 1, for example. Now, obviously there's more to developing than just the dilutions, but it is an important factor, which leads to the question, with Rodinal, is 1 to 25 the limit? Maybe 1 to 8, 1 to 2? Would it even be possible to develop in straight, undiluted Rodinal? There's only one way to find out. A couple things to lay out before we begin. First, I shot everything with Ilford HP5 at box speed, and developed everything at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. Next, I decided to shoot the same thing over and over again on an entire roll. It just makes comparing a little easier, and I only developed about 3 frames worth for each step. So let's get on with it. This is 1 to 100. This was a 16-minute development, and it developed just fine. It's a normal tried and true dilution. Next is 1 to 50. This took about 11 minutes to develop, and like 1 to 100 before it, it looks fine. Again, this is just another standard dilution. This is 1 to 25. This was a 6-minute development, and it was more of the same. It also just looks fine. If you notice, the development times are getting shorter and shorter very quickly, which means moving forward is going to be a little tricky. 1 to 100, 1 to 50, and 1 to 25 all have established development times, and for me, anything beyond that is kind of a guessing game. Also contributing to the whole mess is that the next dilution I'm going to is 1 to 16 and not 1 to 12. It makes the math a little cleaner at the end, and it'll make sense as we go on. So now I had to figure out how long I needed to develop the film for. I looked at the development times for 1 to 100, 1 to 50, and 1 to 25, and I figured out what the delta was between each step and used that to extrapolate for other times. And this is where a mistake accidentally solved for a problem I didn't know I had. I calculated that for 1 to 16 it would be about a 2.5 minute development. The problem was I autopilot for the first few minutes of development, and it wasn't until 3.5 minutes in I realized I wasn't paying attention. I assumed the film was going to be overdeveloped, but it actually turned out looking okay. That was when I realized that my numbers were way off. As someone who's bad at both math and science, it seemed like a smart idea at the time, but at this point I just don't trust those numbers, so I just winged it, and I decided to go with my gut feeling. For 1 to 8, I went with a 2-minute development, and it actually looked fine. Maybe a smidge underdeveloped, but otherwise totally usable. Now, for 1 to 4, I decided to do something a little different. I started to tray develop. Instead of 300 milliliters of total solution inside a tank, I could use 75 milliliters in a tray. This was strictly a cost-saving measure because the dilution amounts were getting really up there, and I thought, well, what's the worst that could happen? Anyway, I developed this for 1.5 minutes, and it also looks fine. It looks a little underfixed, but I don't care. For 1 to 2, this was developed for 1 minute flat, and again, it came out looking alright. Now, if you look at all of these strips, there are slight variations in the densities. I tried my best to get them to match, but overall, I'd say they're all within the margin of error, and I would call them usable. If I had more time, and more specifically if I cared enough, I could probably get them pretty close to matching, but unfortunately I'm just blasting through this. For 1 to 1, I screwed up again. I was hoping to do a 30-second development, but I spaced out and I accidentally developed this for 45 seconds. It came out a little toasty. You could also start to see where the short development times plus the tray developing caused some development issues. Overall, it looks overdeveloped, but I could easily see it work out with a few seconds shaved off. And I would have tried it again, but I was running low on film and I was kind of getting hungry, so I just pressed on. Now, this is the reason why you're all here. You want to see what film looks like when it's developed in undiluted Rodinal. So, here you go. Oh, yeah, that's not good. This was developed for 11 seconds. If you ignore the smudges and the scratches and the dust, this still looks like garbage. It's way underdeveloped, so I tried it again. This was developed for 30 seconds. It looks better, but it's still underdeveloped. I went back and I developed the last bit of film I had for 45 seconds. and it still came out thin. And remember, 1:1 for 45 seconds was overdeveloped, and yet for some reason undiluted for 45 seconds came out underdeveloped. Like, I don't know what's going on. To further complicate things, the base looks like it's starting to get fogged. So if I tried to overdevelop it to get the density up, it'll probably just fog the base as well. I realized that I now had a brand new problem. I was running low on Rodinal. I couldn't find any adox Rodinal locally, so I ended up picking up some rollei Compard R09 instead. Adox Rodinal is the new formulation, whereas R09 is the old formulation. From everything I've read, there doesn't seem to be any discernible difference between the two, and from the tests I've done previously, they seem to behave and develop all the same. To test this, I developed another strip in undiluted R09 for 1 minute. If you just ignore the fact that my handling was much sloppier, the results look pretty much the same, so I feel comfortable with R09 as a substitute. Next, I intentionally tried to overdevelop it. So here's how it turned out in 2.5 minutes. Yeah, it's fried, but that's actually good because we now know what the upper limit is. So I decided to dial it back and I went with 1 minute and 45 seconds. I actually think the density looks fine, it's really that base fog that's killing it. I figured this is a little overdeveloped, so something like 1.5 minutes would work, and probably be about as good as it gets. I felt confident enough, and I decided to go full scale. No more dinky 75ml tray development, you're not here to see me skimp out on the chemistry. I'm gonna go with the full 300ml. It felt so wrong to dump so much Rodinal into a tank, but there is no looking back now. 1.5 minutes later, this is what I got. Yeah, I absolutely fried this roll. Either the way I was tray developing wasn't right, or the chemistry in such small quantities behaved differently, because at around 1.5 minutes I was struggling to get decent density, and with this, all I got was density. I'm not sure how well this will pick up on camera, but there's actually stuff here. It's not just solid black, and I was able to scan it. All things considered, this doesn't look as bad as I thought it was going to look. I mean, the grain is unapologetically aggressive, and I feel like the grain looks like something you'd see in a smaller format like Minox or 110, so I could see this possibly looking pretty cool in a larger format, but at least with 35mm, it's rough. At least the trichrome worked, so there's that. Okay, I wasn't expecting this to turn out like that. I took some garbage shots around my place and I threw it into the soup, but this time for 45 seconds. And this was still pretty cooked, and there's some weird uneven development issues, but it's looking better. Like, we will eventually get there. So I shot some more and I developed it for 10 seconds. And holy crap, it actually kind of worked. I feel sort of vindicated because in my first undiluted attempt, it was 11 seconds and it failed miserably. But this looks alright. It's a little underexposed, but I blame that on the fact that I was using a macro lens and a flash. If you look at the printed text on the rebate, it actually looks properly developed. There's some kind of uneven development going on. You could see it in these splotches on the wall. And there's some other weirdness like surge marks and stuff, which I'm guessing stems from the short development time. But otherwise it looks alright. If you look at these negatives, these frames were shot without a flash, and if you're just eyeballing it, the density looks pretty comparable to 1:100. So it's totally possible to develop an undiluted Rodinal. Would I recommend the process? I mean, if you needed to develop film in 10 seconds and your life depended on it, sure, I guess. Otherwise just develop it normally, you'll get more consistent results. But it's cool to know that you could do it.